Welcome to the keynote session of the Utah State Historical Society's 68th Annual Conference. I'm Dr. Holly George of Utah Historical Quarterly, and today we have the privilege of hearing from Dr. Lisa Tetrault, an associate professor at Carnegie Mellon University. Dr. Tetrault specializes in the history of gender, race, and American democracy, with an emphasis on social movements and memory. A frequent commentator on the suffrage centennial, Tetrault is currently at work on a genealogy of the 19th Amendment. Her research has been funded by the Smithsonian Institution, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard, and the Library of Congress. She lives in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Our talk is also being streamed live on our Utah State History Facebook page, and a question and answer period will follow the presentation. Catherine Kitterman is also with us. She's a historian for Better Days 2020, and she will join us during the Q&A session. I'd ask you to submit your questions via chat or in the Q&A feature, either one. I'll be monitoring both. So with that, I am going to turn the time to Dr. Tetrault. Thank you very much.
Hi, it's so lovely to be with you all. I'm just going to do the awkward thing of quickly sharing my screen. I'm putting this on presenter view. There we go. So thank you so much to the Utah Historical Society and to Holly George, Catherine Kitterman, and everyone else. And thanks especially to the panel this morning. It was wonderful. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it's such an important topic. And hopefully the talk today will actually help situate the panel this morning on Native voting rights. I'm here to talk about the 19th Amendment, but rather than, that is of course the year that women supposedly got the right to vote in the United States, here emblazoned across the United States. And that was the year the 19th Amendment was ratified and added to the US Constitution, the so-called Women's Suffrage Amendment. And that story is one that's fairly well known, and it often goes something like this. Here's a headline from August 26th of 1920, or August 18th, excuse me. Tennessee House ratifies, giving women of the entire nation vote this fall. And then if we do Google searches, we often turn up with a story like this. It granted women the right to vote. It guarantees all women the right to vote. And these are things that are frequently said about the 19th Amendment. But what I'm going to focus on today is re-narrating the 19th Amendment in a very different frame. And I'm going to question this idea of a right to vote. Part of what I want to do then is situate 1920 not as the beginning of women's voting or as the end of women's pursuit of voting rights, but as really the middle of a much longer story that is unfinished and has been handed to you and me. So if you look at this map, there is this asterisk here, and if you look down on the original of this, it says some women voted before and not all women voted after. And that's precisely the story I want to tell today, because I think the way we talk about voting rights in the United States often doesn't do sufficient justice to our understanding of voting rights in the United States. So we're going to take a somewhat different approach to this topic today. And we're going to start not with a social movement, not with women's first demands for the vote. We're going to start with the Constitution itself, because we are, in fact, talking about amending a Constitution. And we should therefore consider what the Constitution says, and also how the Constitution was amended. If I were to ask you there in the audience, if we were together, I might ask for a show of hands of who thinks your voting rights reside in the Constitution. My guess is many of you probably think that your voting rights, if you have them, reside in the Constitution. And what's surprising to people as I've been speaking is that there is in fact no voting right for citizens in the United States, not in the Constitution at the founding and still not now, despite centuries of activism on this point. The founding fathers skirted this question. Nowhere in the Constitution or in the Bill of Rights are voting rights mentioned for citizens or for any other political body in the United States. So what happens at the founding is that the states are put in charge of creating voters. And the states don't necessarily thereby create a right to vote. What the states do is just say, you have to do these things, you have to be these things in order to be a voter. So in other words, there is no voting right anywhere in the new nation, then really or now. What there are a series of qualifications that you have to meet in order to access voting. So what we have in the United States is a negative right to vote. We have obstacles, and sometimes those obstacles are cleared. And when those obstacles are taken out of our way, we call that the achievement of a right to vote. But really what we've done is had obstacle removed. We haven't been conferred with a right to vote. And that's going to be the subject of my talk today. Because I think when we understand the 19th Amendment in that frame, the 19th Amendment is still very much a live issue, as are all of the voting rights movements that it fits into. So at the founding, there was very little uniform among the states about who could and couldn't vote. For example, race was not uniform across the states. Even gender was not uniform across the states. New Jersey allowed women to vote at the founding if they fit all the other criteria. The one thing that was fairly universal was property holding. For reasons that are convoluted in American history and have a lot to do with the unfolding of slavery, property holding will eventually fade away. And by the 1820s and 30s, all states will move to requiring, among other things, that voters be white and male. And those are the two words that I'm going to talk about today. They are by no means the only things that states require voters to be, but those are the two disenfranchising qualifications that go together and are part of our story today. So out of the 1830s and 40s, just right after this advent of white and male as universal across the states, a women's rights movement emerges out of anti-slavery. And in that women's rights movement, which is discernible by the 1850s, which is a biracial co-ed movement, there are many, many demands, among which is a demand for a right to vote. And 19th century Americans, much like us, refer to the right to vote in this kind of broad general sense. But what this group would have demanded was not a constitutional amendment, because this group in the 1850s in the antebellum United States understood quite clearly that the Constitution had nothing to do with voting. So you wouldn't go to the Constitution to try to secure a voting right. What you would do instead is go to the states and try to remove the obstacle that stood in your way. And that's the way they pursued so-called voting rights in this era, not by creating a conferral of a right to vote, but by removing an obstacle. In other words, a negative affirmation of a right to vote. So one of the questions we have to ask then is, where does the constitutional amendment come from? Because really it's an odd way to pursue voting rights. And the answer there is, it comes out of the American Civil War. The American Civil War settles two questions: that the nation shall remain whole, it shall remain unified. And secondly, that chattel slavery, at least as an official institution, is no longer, it is dead. And out of that struggle comes a whole new battle in the United States known as Reconstruction. And Reconstruction is the question of, on what basis are we going to rebuild the nation? Freed people have a lot of demands on freedom. Many white Americans are not willing to grant their demands on freedom. Are they citizens? Are they voters? Are they covered by the same laws? One of the things that freed people demand, voting, is something Congress decides to take up, because they know that the white states to the South will not grant voting to African Americans. So Congress has, almost 100 years into US history, the very first debate on the voting rights of citizens of the United States, which is kind of shocking when you think about it, that Congress has never had a robust debate about the voting rights of American citizens until almost 100 years into our history. And what they decide to do is absolutely revolutionary. They decide to pass a constitutional amendment for Black men's voting. During this debate, many different versions of the constitutional amendment are proposed. And this will be the basis for women suffragists turning to a constitutional amendment. But one of the things to note is that there's a proposition during this debate that a positive affirmation of a right to vote be created. In other words, that all citizens are entitled to vote, they have a right to vote, they are vested with a right to vote, and Congress shall be in charge of elections. And Congress shall, govern this right. That never gains traction. And it doesn't gain traction all across the North and the West, partly because states really like disenfranchising, and they don't want to give up the right to disenfranchise citizens. And most African Americans live in the South, and so Northern states practice disenfranchisement as well against immigrants and others. And they don't want to give up that. Also, it would let all women into voting, right? Because all citizens, or at least all women who were citizens, would be let into voting. So for a variety of reasons, this is a bridge too far. What they do is radical, but it's not that radical. What they do instead is pass the 15th Amendment, which is a compromise. And it again pursues this negative pursuit of a right to vote. There shall be no discrimination in voting, it says, on the basis of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. So what that does, again, is not invest Black men with voting, which we often refer to it as having done. It strikes the word white in all the states across the country who use white as a voting qualification, which at this point is all states. And across the South, where most African-American men live, this unleashes the first biracial, meaningful, full-scale biracial democracy in the United States. And African-American men begin voting in massive numbers. You'll notice this amendment says nothing about race or about sex. And that turns out to be vexing for a whole variety of white suffragists. The reason it only enfranchises men is because that word male is still on the books as a state voting qualification. So it eliminates the word white, but it leaves male in place. That feminist abolitionist coalition is deeply affected by this particular piece of history. And they reconvene after the American Civil War to make two demands: voting rights for African Americans and voting rights for women. When the 15th Amendment clears Congress, many people in that coalition think, hallelujah, we must do everything we can to make sure this clears ratification at the states. Save for these two women here. And this is Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her coadjutor, Susan B. Anthony, two of the century's most famous suffragists. They arrive at this meeting incensed that women have been left out of the 15th Amendment. And they show up and speak against the amendment. And very famously, as Elizabeth Cady Stanton will get into a pretty ugly row with Frederick Douglass, the nation's leading African-American statesman, himself once an enslaved person. And Stanton will say no to the 15th Amendment. I will not support its ratification. I will not fight for its passage at the states. If there is a question of priority, then educated white womanhood must go first. And she calls Black men ignorant sambos, and she said that they will be ground under the heel of ignorant manhood, white women, that they will be defiled by ignorant voters. She insults immigrants and other people. And clearly is on display here a really strong sense of racial hierarchy in Stanton herself. Douglass counters. We are having our lives daily threatened across the South. We are being hunted down by vigilante mobs. Our brains are being dashed out on the pavement, he says. Our bodies are being hung from lampposts. We must have the vote now to save our lives. And Stanton and Anthony say no. And they break with this coalition, and they form the first National Woman Suffrage Association in the United States in 1869. And they are dedicated to the defeat of the 15th Amendment. And they are also, however, dedicated to a brand new idea, which is a women's suffrage amendment. They argue the one redeeming feature of the 15th Amendment is that it is federalized suffrage. It has changed the constitutional prerogatives around who governs voting. So they say, let's have a new amendment that enfranchises women, as we would call it, that is called the 16th Amendment. Their allies in the coalition are stunned at their behavior. A few people trickle out with Stanton and Anthony, but the vast majority of them align behind a woman named Lucy Stone, an equally famous suffragist of the era who we often forget about. She organizes the American Woman Suffrage Association, and most people align behind her. She, however, supports the 15th Amendment and also says a constitutional amendment for women's voting is unlawful. We must not pursue women's voting through a constitutional amendment. Because she says the 15th Amendment was a war measure. It does not change constitutional sovereignty. That resides with the states. And so to achieve voting, we must work at the state level. So immediately we have a kind of constitutional governance split in the movement, a split over race, a split over a whole variety of things. There are also African-American women present at this particular moment. In this coalition, women like Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, an educator, a poet, an essayist, a civil rights activist, a women's rights speaker, a civil rights speaker, and she will stand up and say to this assembly, to those folks assembled, we cannot divide this question. They will make the kind of, and she will make, and other Black women will make the kinds of intersectional critique that we associate with Black feminism in the late 20th and early 21st century, saying, I represent both of these identities. We cannot split this question. And she says quite famously, we are all bound up in one great bundle of humanity. Black women will lose this day. They will not have their argument carry. And Black women will largely fade out of white suffrage organizing. So while this group is organizing, Black women dip in and out of white organizing, but they never find a very comfortable home there. And one of the things we have to remember in this anniversary is that if we want to recover Black women's stories, we can't just look inside white organizations, because those organizations rarely represented the interests of Black women. So Black women didn't work there. They went and organized on their own. And to locate their stories, we have to go find them where they are. They would continue to agitate for suffrage, but they would never have the luxury of arguing for that alone. Stanton and Anthony will, from henceforth, be advocates of a constitutional amendment. Their wording will be exactly the same as the 15th Amendment. It says that states may not abridge voting on account of sex. So in other words, this would also not invest women with a right to vote. What it would do instead is create a negative right to vote by clearing an obstacle, and thereby women would have access. It would clear the obstacle of male in state voter qualification clauses. You see here the right of citizens to vote in this amendment. It was also in the 15th Amendment, but I didn't excerpt it there. That is, in fact, much like we use that term today, something that they absolutely believed they were invested in. It was a powerful idea, but it had absolutely no legal status or no legal, there. This goes nowhere for 50 years. It will be, it won't clear Congress for 50 years in 1919 and then be ratified in 1920. Meanwhile, if we go back to that story in the States, there's quite a lot unfolding, as you in Utah are quite aware. There are endless state victories that precede 1920. And millions of women are voting as a result before 1920. First in the territory of Wyoming in 1869, then in the territory of Utah in 1870. And then by the 1890s and the 1900s and the 1910s, many, many Western states are doing what we would call enfranchising women. Although they're not really giving women voting rights, what they're doing is just eliminating the obstruction of male, eliminating the obstacle male, striking that down. And that also did not mean that all women could vote. It meant that if you cleared all the other obstacles that your state had up, you could vote, right? So some women still could not vote even after male came down. But the point I want to make here, and this is a lithograph from 1915 with votes for women on the Cape, and of course she's marching triumphantly across the United States, kind of in this story that we often have, if we're white in particular, of American democracy as a kind of steady opening to kind of where we are now in this kind of fully flourished American democracy of the 21st century, which I'm going to throw into question today. So this is what women's suffrage in the United States looks like on the eve of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. All these salmon-colored states allow women to vote on the same terms as men. In other words, they don't have a voter qualification that requires that voters be male. They have plenty of other voter qualifications. All these denim-colored states, which are only 8, don't allow women to vote on any terms whatsoever. Here I am sitting in Pennsylvania. And all these other colored states have something called partial suffrage, a story we often forget about. Partial suffrage was where women could vote in certain types of elections, but not all elections. So they didn't vote on the same terms as men. They just voted in certain types of elections. So there were things like school suffrage, because, the ladies, and municipal suffrage, presidential suffrage. And I want to draw our attention just really quickly to the story of Illinois in 1913. Because it gives lie to one of the correctives that has come up in the anniversary that is helpful, but not entirely helpful, whereby white women got the right to vote in 1920, but women of color didn't. And that's not helpful in a variety of ways because no one got the right to vote in 1920. And what happens is it depends on where you live. It is either a state-accessed prerogative. So Black women were voting in Illinois in 1913 because there was no restriction of race or no other thing that stood in their way. And very famously, the nation's leading civil rights and anti-lynching crusader, women's rights crusader, Ida B. Wells, an all-around just absolute just powerhouse of a human, organizes Black women to start voting in 1913 in Illinois. She forms in Chicago the Alpha Suffrage Club, a Black suffrage club of women, and they start leveraging their electoral power in a very organized, concerted fashion along with men of color. And they elect, before 1920, some of the first African-American representatives from Illinois to Congress and alderperson and others. So what I want to point out here again is it mattered where you lived. We can't say that all women of color started voting in a certain era. while the states are racking up victories, those national and American organizations from the early mid-19th century unify in 1890 into the very cumbersome named National American Women's Suffrage Association. People don't usually say this big mouthful. They'll just pronounce this acronym, and they'll call it NAWSA. Susan B. Anthony will take charge of NAWSA in 1890. Lucy Stone will die in 1893. Stanton will then hand over leadership, Anthony will hand over leadership to Carrie Chapman Catt in 1900. Stanton dies in 1902, Anthony in 1906. And none of those founding white women would live to see the ratification of the 19th Amendment. By the early 1900s, Carrie Chapman Catt herself has given up the fight for a federal amendment inside NAWSA. And she has decided instead to pursue what she calls the winning strategy, which is pursuing state by state by state. And her idea is, if we get enough states, they will fall like dominoes and eventually just bring about a federal amendment. And her strategy was correct in many ways, because it is no doubt part of the reason we got a federal amendment was precisely because so many women were already voting. And it showed that this would not throw the world off its axis if women began to vote. Women are voting by the millions. Meanwhile, because social organizing is extremely messy and fraught and never the kind of kumbaya, harmonious kind of collaboration that we often imagine it to be, there is a young upstart inside NAWSA named Alice Paul. Alice Paul comes from a very, very different kind of political upbringing than Carrie Chapman Catt, where she wants to curry the favor of politicians, get the politicians to like her, get them to voluntarily hand over voting rights. Alice Paul says, no. I want to bring back a fight for a federal amendment, enough with the state campaign. And I want to bring the fight straight to the politicians, and I want to make them uncomfortable. I want to make them squirm so that they concede voting because they can no longer deny it to us, not because we've kind of won over their favor. And she gets permission from Carrie Chapman Catt from inside NAWSA to launch a very dramatic parade through the streets of Washington, D.C. in 1913 to re-announce the relaunching of a federal suffrage campaign for this federal amendment. And this is the amendment right here on the float. We're kind of announcing the return of the federal amendment. Thousands of women march from all over the country in this parade, and tens of thousands of men, largely, although not only, turn out in the streets to watch. They do this on the eve of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. And this is deliberate, because he opposes women's suffrage. And so they say, if you are going to come to Washington, D.C., we are going to upstage you in order to underline your opposition to women's voting. The crowd turns violent. It starts to attack the women marchers. Scores are sent to the hospital. And when this happens, the parade makes front page headlines the following day as Woodrow Wilson is being inaugurated, and Alice Paul has what she wants. She has the attention of America, and she is embarrassing the president on a national stage. Meanwhile, just to go back to that story of how African-American women are organizing elsewhere and often don't find comfortable homes inside of white organizations, or at least largely white organizations, women of color come to this march, including Ida B. Wells from Chicago. Mary Church Terrell is there, a Black sorority chapter is there, and Alice Paul will ask them to march at the rear of the parade to please and to coddle white supremacists who would not want African-American women in the midst of white women. Of course, African-American women find this deeply offensive, and Ida B. Wells, for one, refuses. And she slips in with the Illinois delegation and integrates the parade. Alice Paul will go forward being kicked out of NAWSA because Carrie Chapman Catt can't stand her and thinks that she's going to jeopardize all the hard-earned goodwill that suffragists have built over decades. She kicks her out, and Alice Paul forms the National Woman's Party. And what we have at this point, again, is a divided mainstream suffrage movement. Alice Paul will go on to do all kinds of theatrics leading up to the ratification. She starts picketing the White House. Just to sort of make visible again President Woodrow Wilson's opposition. We then enter World War I, and they begin embarrassing Woodrow Wilson on an international stage, because the United States enters World War I to make the world safe for democracy. And as Woodrow Wilson sort of defends democracy and upholds democratic values, women start citing his speeches and pointing out the hypocrisy that he is denying voting to women at home. This angers Woodrow Wilson. They're also picketing a wartime president, which is considered unpatriotic. Nassau, meanwhile, throws its efforts into the war, does not try to make waves. Again, Carrie Chapman Catt thinks Alice Paul is causing all kinds of trouble. Eventually, Woodrow Wilson has had enough, but these women are perfectly within their legal rights. They're in front of the People's House on a sidewalk, a public sidewalk, but Woodrow Wilson has them arrested nonetheless, essentially as political prisoners. He has to come up with a trumped up charge, however, and he has them arrested on grounds of obstructing traffic on a sidewalk. They refuse to pay the fines. They go to jail. They go to the Occoquan workhouse, whereby some of them begin to launch hunger strikes. The wardens order them force-fed. They have tubes forced down their throats and their noses, liquid ingredients poured in so that they do not become malnourished and die. And many of them will have digestive troubles for the rest of their lives from the brutality of tubes being forced down their esophagus and into their stomachs. When word gets out of this kind of violence, much as the violence with the parade, white America is pretty shocked that good, upstanding white women are suffering this kind of abuse at the hands of the state and at the hands of men. These women, because of the racial codes in America, are supposed to be immune from that kind of violence. Women of color endure this kind of violence on a regular basis. But when white women endure it, it is shocking to the nation. And that, too, will be one of the many, many, many reasons that the amendment will finally come before Congress. Another reason will be all of the patriotic war service that women rendered during World War I. In 1919, then finally, it comes before Congress and passes. Then goes to the states for what will be a nail-biting ratification campaign where 3/4 of the states have to ratify. But I want to just go back to the West for a minute and remind us that the West has already sent a woman to Congress. Montana sends Jeanette Rankin to Congress, elects a woman as its congressional representative in 1917. And so Jeanette Rankin is there on the floor of Congress and gets to vote for the 19th Amendment, for what we call so-called women's voting rights. Goes to the states for ratification, as I said, quickly states line up, vote for it, and then everything comes to a grinding halt. And they're one state short, and months go by and nothing happens. And they're afraid they're going to lose the ratification fight. Then Tennessee takes it up. And Tennessee is a state known for its opposition to federal interference in so-called states' rights, known for its opposition to black men's voting and for women's voting. And it seems pretty clear that it's going to fail in Tennessee. It's a melee the night before the vote in Tennessee. The liquor lobby is there, women are there. People's votes are being bought. And then it comes to a vote and it's pretty clear it's going to fail until this young man, Harry T. Byrne, the youngest member of the legislature in his 20s, carries with him in his breast pocket this letter here from his mother. And she says to him, I have not been able to determine in the news whether you support suffrage. Please let me know your position. And then she urges him to, quote, be a good boy and vote for ratification. And with that, as he sits on the floor of the House after thousands of votes have taken place in state legislatures across the nation, in Congress many times, in local municipalities, he's weighing the weight of history and he says to himself, I must vote for. And he changes his vote and it clears by a vote of one vote, which again just underscores the contingency of history and social change. Celebrations erupt across the country, and we'll come back to the headlines that we started with, which began the kind of narration that we often have around this story. Giving women of the entire nation vote this fall, guaranteeing women the right to vote, et cetera, et cetera. I want to caution us in that language again and come back to this idea of what governs voting rights in the United States and come back to the language of the 19th Amendment. Because what it says is not that women are invested with a right to vote or that it guarantees women the right to vote. In fact, it doesn't give women anything. What it does is tell the states, you may not use this word male to discriminate. It doesn't actually invest women with anything. But millions of women were barred by that single word, and millions of women access the vote. This is a massive expansion in voters in America, and it is no doubt a historic and hard-fought and important victory, even if it's not often what we claim for it. There are a whole host of women, however, who have other obstacles still in their way. The 19th Amendment helps all women. It is necessary for all women, but it is not sufficient for all women because it leaves standing all other state voter qualifications. And many women, especially women of color, find themselves still ensnared in those state qualifications. And this is especially true across the South because as this triumphal story of American democracy is unfolding over the 1890s and the 1900s and the 1910s, the way we like to narrate the story of American democracy as one of steady opening, that is in fact also a misnomer. The story of American democracy is one of opening and of simultaneous closing. And that is happening at exactly the same time that this is going on. We must come back to the story of African American men voting across the South in the wake of the 15th Amendment. Those meaningful biracial democracies that they create, whereby they send Black representatives to Congress, they elect Black representatives throughout the South, is very short-lived. And vigilante violence quickly overthrows those governments and puts in place white supremacist governments who are suppressing Black men's votes at this point through largely intimidation and violence. They very quickly realize, however, that Congress doesn't really care if the 15th Amendment is enforced. And so they can, as long as they give Congress plausible deniability, starting in 1890, they start to realize we can formally disenfranchise Black men, as long as we don't use the word that the 15th Amendment bans, which is race. So what they do in the 1890s, while states are getting rid of women, is they erect new restrictions called poll taxes, literacy tests. These kind of Jim Crow laws are being thrown up at exactly the same time that other states are removing the word male. And that will mean that when male is taken away from the southern states and from other states, 10 other states in the nation, or actually a dozen or more, also have poll taxes and literacy tests. This is not just a southern phenomenon. In fact, New York has a literacy test. And as I've said, the states like to be able to discriminate in voting. This has historically been true, and it is still a state prerogative to discriminate in voting. So as these are thrown up, but skirt at least the word race, even though they are racially targeted at African Americans. Surely white folks would have come under these laws too, but registrars have enormous power on the ground, and they would just not administer these things to white folks the way they would administer them to African Americans. Not only that, these tests were often fraudulently administered. And so I think this is another reason the 19th Amendment clears ratification in 1920, because white politicians know that if they approve women's suffrage, they will not be approving the voting of women of color. And so women of color are ensnared in these newly erected laws. They will nonetheless fight hard in this moment to test the limits of these laws. They will not sit back when the 19th Amendment is ratified. Women of color will turn out en masse across the South to test the limits of these new laws, to try to clear poll taxes and literacy tests, and to try to access voting. They will show up often in league with African American men who are trying to re-access voting that's recently been stolen from them. They will sometimes have success, but they will be met with, again, campaigns of unbelievable violence and repression and unbelievably fraudulently administered laws. So for example, a woman in Virginia who knows she can clear a literacy test goes to take the literacy test so that she can vote. And she's handed by the registrar a blank piece of paper in 1920. Of course, she can't pass a blank piece of paper, and she is declared to have failed. As this goes forward, it becomes more and more absurd as it plays out across southern states. Mississippi famously demands that you have to be able to name the number of bubbles in a bar of soap. Other states say you have to be able to name all 68 county judges. Others say you have to be able to write the word forward, backward, you know, and it just becomes absurd, these literacy tests. They're meant to sound plausible, but be impossible. And so what happens after this is that women of color, and not just Black women across the South, but women of color across the United States, come to the flagship white suffrage organizations in 1920 and say, the fight must continue, the fight must go on. And we are still not accessing voting. And those white suffrage organizations, true to form, say, we don't care. That's your fight. Our fight is over. We won what we wanted. Your fight is your own. And that had been true for Black women already, right? And it is confirmed once again. And Black women will continue to organize after 1920, but they will not call themselves women suffragists. But we shouldn't confuse the story of women in voting as being bounded by the terms women's suffrage, because it is not. Black women do not have the luxury of just organizing around gender, because Black men need the right to vote at the same time, nor do they have the luxury of calling themselves suffragists, because they're organizing around lots of issues. But they will nonetheless make voting a central part of their fight for civil rights. We can also not think of civil rights as just a masculine endeavor. Women were here. They were fighting for gender equality in civil rights organizing and in the United States itself. Septima Clark will open freedom schools at the beginning of the 20th century, often secretly to avoid vigilante violence, to try to get people to be able to pass literacy tests. Fannie Lou Hamer, a sharecropper across Mississippi, in Mississippi, will try to go register in 1962 and suffer a campaign of unbelievable violence and economic vigilante violence in reprisal. She will become a very famous activist in the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and she will appear before the Democratic National Committee in 1964 to tell her story and bring the kinds of violent repression against African Americans across the South to a national audience. LBJ will be so threatened by her testimony before a national audience that he will interrupt with a, sort of trumped up a national service announcement, which just leads Americans more to want to know, what did Miss Hamer say? Amelia Boynton is a really important activist in the fight from Selma to Montgomery. She will be one of the people who's beaten to a bloody pulp, along with John Lewis and others, as they fight for voting rights and usher in the signing in 1965 of the Voting Rights Act. This too is a story of women in voting. And the Voting Rights Act will be the first time that many women of color and many men of color finally clear the obstacles of literacy tests and things like that across the South. But I would point out that the Voting Rights Act has exactly the same method of conferring rights that the 15th and the 19th Amendment did, which is it negatively confers right. It goes to the states and strikes down targeted restrictions, but leaves constitutional governance around voting the same. It does not invest anyone with a right to vote. All it does is say to the states, you cannot use all white registrars. You cannot, use literacy tests. You cannot do these things. And in many ways, the Voting Rights Act represents, in many ways, the return of federal oversight into the South and the enforcement of the 15th Amendment 100 years later. It really took Congress 100 years to come back into the South and say, okay, fine, we'll finally enforce the 15th Amendment. And it goes a step further. The Voting Rights Act will also say to the states, you know what, you have been misbehaving badly for 100 years now. Where you have a history of misbehaving badly, we're going to take away your ability to pass voting law. You're going to have to clear it with us first, the federal government, and it goes to the Department of Justice. And if that law is racially discriminatory, the federal government is going to prevent you from being able to enact it. And for decades after the Voting Rights Act is signed, the federal government continues to strike down state racially discriminatory laws. Remember, the states have the right to dream up new criteria that voters have to meet. And that's not violating anyone's right to vote, because nobody has a right to vote, which is part of why the states can continue to dream up restrictions. And that federal oversight of the states will continue to be incredibly powerful in keeping democracy open across the United States to folks of color and many, many other folks. In the wake of this, it is another massive victory, even if it does not positively confer voting rights. And voting registration numbers, percentages go from single digits across the South and other places in the United States to 65 to 85% in rapid rate. But I want to point out that these are not the only ways in which people were restricted from voting after 1920, women. We had lots of other ways that people were barred from voting, particularly women, since we're talking about the 19th Amendment. We had racially targeted citizenship laws. The Chinese Exclusion Act, passed in the 1880s, meant that Asian Americans were not eligible for citizenship until the 1950s. And even when they became eligible for citizenship in the 1950s, they then had to clear all the restrictions at the state level, right? Because citizenship does not confer voting. So the story of Asian Americans accessing voting is also critically tied to the Voting Rights Amendment, or the Voting Rights Act. Same with Latino Americans, Latina Americans, Latinx Americans. They would be ensnared in literacy tests and poll taxes and citizenship restrictions. And the Voting Rights Act would be instrumental in allowing them to access voting as well, including the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act, which was a temporary piece of legislation, has been reauthorized multiple times. It created bilingual ballots. It created a whole variety of things that have given people access to voting. The Voting Rights Act has really created, for the first time, a meaningful, full democracy in the United States, which is in many of our lifetimes, which is sort of shocking when you think about it. And I do want to mention, although this morning's panel did a much more robust discussion of this than I'll be able to here, that for Indigenous Americans, for Native Americans, this was a very different kind of issue, because the pursuit of voting rights at the beginning of the 20th century was a vexed issue, because that meant colonization, right? We can't always think about the granting of voting rights as necessarily a positive good, because for many people that meant the loss of sovereignty. It meant being subsumed under a colonizing power that they didn't want to be consumed under. And so whether or not to pursue voting rights, how to pursue voting rights within Native communities over this history that we're talking about has always been a fraught issue. And again, much of that citizenship, even that eligibility, wouldn't come about until the 1940s. And then, of course, the Voting Rights Act has been incredibly important for Indigenous Americans as well. And we heard this morning about a sort of Native Voting Rights Act. I do want to say, though, that although that period when the Voting Rights Act was robustly enforcing democracy in the United States and sort of preventing the states from racially discriminating, that is no longer the case. Because a positive right to vote was never won, that has now been destroyed. And Shelby County v. Holder in 2013 said, essentially, it was a Supreme Court decision that gutted the Voting Rights Act and essentially said discrimination, racial discrimination in voting is a thing of the past. The Voting Rights Act eliminated that. So no longer can the federal government strike down state laws around voting. No longer can the federal government deem something racially discriminatory and strike it down. The states are free to erect whatever voting laws they want now, because we don't believe they will discriminate. And of course, we heard this morning about RBG's famous umbrella analogy in her scathing dissent. I will point out here that Chief Justice John Roberts, who wrote the decision and who was the majority author, his job in the 1980s was in the Reagan DOJ trying to kill the reauthorization of the Voting Rights Act. So he has had a long history of trying to destroy the Voting Rights Act. In the wake of the destruction of the Voting Rights Act, we are now in exactly the same kind of historical pattern we've been in, an opening and then a closing. And so what's happening now at the state level is that states are free to erect racially discriminatory laws again, as long as they don't explicitly do it in the ways that the feds or the Constitution have barred them from doing: race, sex, literacy tests, poll taxes, which we didn't talk about, certain age restriction, things like that. But so what the states have done in the wake of this, and in fact, Texas had a racially discriminatory ID law that the DOJ had prevented them from enacting, and Texas will enact it 2 hours after the Shelby County decision, knowing that it's racially discriminatory. We currently are in the midst of, and this is now an old map, all states would be red, we are currently in the midst of the most massive wave of voter suppression in the United States since before the passage of the Voting Rights Act. And I can talk about different ways in which women are, in the year that women are supposedly enfranchised, that women won the right to vote, in the centennial of that, tens of thousands of, and possibly millions of women are being thrown off the voter rolls, prevented from registering, prevented from casting meaningful ballots. And this was before the 2016 election, I would point out. And before Donald Trump was elected in 2016, these are all stories we can talk about later if you want, the United States was downgraded from a fully functional to a flawed democracy by the Economist Democracy Index, which is a nonpartisan thing, that a nonpartisan entity that gauges the health of global democracy. So I just want to say right now, the United States democracy is not functioning well. We are not a story of steady opening and of triumph. And partly because we are unusual in constitutional democracies around the globe, that we do not have a right to vote in the United States that exists beyond our thinking or our belief that we're possessed of one. In fact, what has been won historically is the elimination of targeted state restrictions, but the ability for states to create new and cumbersome restrictions, which is exactly what states are doing right now with closing early voting, purging voter ID rolls, creating racial IDs, the disenfranchisement of the formerly incarcerated, all kinds of things like this. So what I want to point out to you is that If we take a slightly different frame on 1920, we can see how the past and how 1920 is reaching forward to us, how it has given us a history that people have fought for and died for, and have given their energies and their commitments. And that is an unfinished history that has been handed to you and me right now in the present. And it is up to us what happens next. This history is by no means over. And so we must ask ourselves now, what next? What will we fight for? How will we protect American democracy? Thank you.
Dr. Tetrault, thank you. That was excellent. We're going to open it up to questions now, and let's have Catherine Kitterman start.
Unmuting myself. There's so much that we could dive into. This has been a really rich presentation, and especially in this year where we've been commemorating voting anniversaries and looking ahead to a large election in the nation, it's been so helpful to put those pieces together and think about this long time frame. I would just love to hear your thoughts on, as you've researched the history of women's voting rights, a lot of your work has talked about some of these myths or misconceptions that we have about voting. And are there other myths that need to be reexamined, other things you'd like to see change about our understanding there?
So many, but this is really the myth that I'm focused on right now, is this myth of voting rights. I think it matters a lot how we talk about voting rights right now and how we talk about their achievement in the past, because it misleads us in the present to think that we are invested with such a positive affirmation. And we are not. And as long as we are not, the states are free to come up with new ways to obstruct voting, as long as they don't do it on the grounds that social movements have won, the elimination of. So to me, that's really the biggest thing to be aware of. But of course, there's so much work being done also that is so pivotal right now to expand the narrative more generally and move away from narrating women and voting rights around this kind of 1848 to 1920 moment, because it eliminates and obscures so much of the story. So I'm thinking of Kathleen Cahill's recent book, or the one that's forthcoming, called Recasting the Ballot, looking at the biographies of a collective biography of women of color who fought for voting: Nina Otero Warren, Sitka Lassa, Gertrude Bonin also is her anglicized name, and lots of other people, Mabel Lee, Chinese American, and Martha Jones's book, Vanguard, trying to do exactly what I was talking about, which is saying, let's go to where Black women are and find their activism and tell a whole different and new story that's not bounded by an 1848 to 1920 narrative. And there's so much re-narrating, I think, that much of the work of my book was trying to kind of unravel the 1848 to 1920 story and historicize that. And I feel like there's so much work that's come into the breach now and just exploded that and offered new ways to narrate it. And I feel like that mythology, which people have been questioning for a long time, I'm not alone, is now being replaced by new narratives and kind of new through lines that I think is really helpful in undoing that kind of mythology of 1848 to 1920, which is a really unhelpful way of imagining this history.
Absolutely. That's been one of these, such the interesting thing to watch in national commemorations locally, as people are examining and re-examining the history of voting, especially in this year. It's been very, very exciting to see so many new characters in the cast of characters that are being trotted out as part of that story, and so many new questions. There's a lot more ups and downs and steps forward and backward than we have maybe focused on in the past. And that's a more helpful story.
Yeah, and it's interesting too, because it's one of these stories that we think we know so well. And one of the things we're finding, as you were pointing to, Catherine, is this idea of new questions, is there's so much we don't know about this history. There's so much still to be written. I think that's also coming out right now in the centennial. And I've been heartened that the centennial has not been quite the 1848 to 1920 moment that I was afraid it was going to be. But I do still think that there's a lot of re-narrating to do in terms of how we tell this story in a way that equips us to really understand our connection to that history and our the ways in which that history is still manifest in the present. So,
absolutely.
We have a question from Richard Saunders. He asks, How would the Civil Rights Act of 1966 have taken the country in a different direction with relation to voting rights?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I'm sorry. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964?
Yeah.
So the Civil Rights Act of 1964 says almost nothing about voting, which is a real problem. And some of the 50s Civil Rights Acts had tried to say things about voting, but didn't do it very effectively. And it won't be until, so Richard Saunders is typing in, nope, 1966. I have to say I'm not a late 20th century historian. I don't know what the Civil Rights Act of 1966 is, so I can't speak to that. Richard, did you want to speak to that? I can't speak to what it would have done for voting because I simply don't know anything about its voting provisions.
Just a minute. Let me give him permissions to talk. Let's figure this out. Okay. Or if you want to,
the Voting Rights Act of 65, right, the year before this, and the Voting Rights Act is hugely influential. So.
Okay. All right, Richard.
Oh boy. Okay. When I was in National Archives a few years ago, I pulled a document out there, and it was John Doerr's draft for the Civil Rights Act of 1966.
Okay.
It was a dramatic document. It's nearly 3 inches thick.
Wow.
I'm wondering if anybody, if you can tell what would have happened. Now, the word that he got back from Johnson was, let's not go down this direction. Let's see if the Voting Rights Act has the effect that we intended to go. So it never actually was passed. But I'm wondering if I guess maybe you've never seen it. Then maybe.
No, I've never seen it. I don't know it.
I'm just wondering what it might have done, because it was punitive to say would be to say the least. I'm just curious if anybody's ever explored that.
There's a lot of literature about voting in the 60s. I don't claim to have an encyclopedic knowledge of it, so I can't say if people have or haven't, but I would say that what you're pointing to is obviously a really important question, and I just don't know the answer.
There were many roads not taken, and you've pointed to some of those in the earlier part of the history as well. Many different ways the story could have played out.
Yeah.
Thank you. All right, we've got, let's see, some questions in the chat. I'm just going to pull these up. Okay. From Israel Gonzalez, he asks, what was the value of women from Utah, particularly for the female suffrage progress during the end of the 19th and the first half of the following one?
Yeah. I mean, given this is Catherine's domain, I would want to kick it over to Catherine to speak specifically about the role of Utah women. I mean, this is precisely what you've been working on in your public history moment, and in your dissertation.
Well, we'll come back to you for some thoughts as well. I think one of the key things that sometimes gets overlooked, and Dr. Tetrault has mentioned this, is that women who were voting in Western states, as these states racked up different victories, Utah women had been voting again for the second time from 1896 onward, and they were sending elected representatives to Washington, D.C. And we know that Utah senators and congressmen were generally strong supporters of the 19th Amendment, for example. Working with Alice Paul, welcoming suffrage envoys as they walk up the Capitol steps with their petitions, things like that. That was important. Utah women also in some ways punched above their weight in terms of support in other ways. For example, large petitions for a 19th Amendment, what would have been not the 19th Amendment at the time. 1910, for example, Utahns were collecting more signatures than their quotas, or more than other states. So we see, in some ways, I think there's that pioneering era that has been forgotten in suffrage history, and that was even maybe forgotten in the 19-teens as the momentum and the locus of the fight shifted to Washington, D.C. and the halls of Congress more fully. But I think it's important to note that these women who had been voting and were expecting something of elected officials, and had been for a while, had some sway there.
Absolutely.
I'd like to hear your thoughts as well.
So I think I would speak, Catherine, to the point you just made about sort of being forgotten. And I do think, my first book was precisely about how suffragists themselves, particularly Stanton and Anthony, created a master narrative for the campaign that really centered themselves and their fight and their work, and a kind of national story in a way that I think has led to a real underappreciation for the story on the ground, because they wrote a very hierarchical top-down history. And we have continued to narrate really suffrage movement history that way until fairly recently. And one of the things that civil rights historiography told me and taught me over my, career as a grad student is that social movements take place on the ground. That's really where, and so one of the things we haven't done until fairly recently is shift suffrage historiography to this kind of on the ground story. And one of the things I was really frustrated about when I was a grad student is I would read these state studies and they would simply mirror the national story, but then bring it to the state level. And then they would always mention when Stanton and Anthony came to town, because that was always the most important thing, and it was like, I don't know that Stanton and Anthony's presence made a difference at all, So I do think the kind of work that you're doing, Catherine, and other people are doing, I think is so important to challenging the ways in which that 1848 to 1920 story also flips it and makes us look at this movement as a kind of hierarchical top-down structure, as if Stanton and Anthony and the leaders are the people we have to understand, rather than the movement on the ground. And I think that's one of the pieces that we also don't have, is a really robust history of the movement on the ground in the way that you and other people are writing it, that doesn't try to just say, that 1848 to 1920 story, here's how that story happened here. And instead saying, what did happen here? I don't know that it had anything to do with that story. You see what I'm saying? So I think that's another reason why we forget, in many ways, these Utah women, because we fit them into the national story as opposed to understanding them on their own terms.
Catherine, I think we can add to that Tiffany Green's work, if Tiffany is in the audience. Tiffany writes in the quarterly, the Utah Historical Quarterly, about women in scattered in all the counties, and it's just very, very much on the ground. And she's done kind of all this reconnaissance work of ladies on the ground living their lives. And you look at they're activists.
Yeah.
And yeah, so there you go.
And I think of civil rights historiography where people have done this, right? You think of John Demos's, John Dittmer's, I was thinking of the colonial historian, local people, or you think of Charles Payne's, I've got the Light of Freedom, or, some of the early examples of this, and now there's tons of that starts to change the story of civil rights, right, by narrating it from the ground. And so I'm wondering what's going to happen as all this local historiography, stuff going on in Utah, comes together. What down the road is all that going to amount to? I'm really curious to see, because I think it's going to amount to something different than what we now know.
I love that thought. I think, as you mentioned, we've been stuck in a replication of great man history. Maybe we've replaced it with great woman history.
Yeah, in many ways, that's the history Stanton and Anthony wrote, right? And that's what has been bequeathed to us. And it's surprising how much traction that's had. As it's kind of fallen apart in other historiographic arenas, we have nonetheless preserved it in suffrage history. And it really, I don't know, I was endlessly annoyed by it in grad school. But
one comment I wanted to make, something that I found so interesting, Lisa, this morning and in your talk, was how this is the question of voting rights is often, as in so many things, a conversation between state and federal. Navigating that relationship.
Yeah, it is really a state story that the feds occasionally intervene in and slap their hands about, right? So the states are over here grabbing votes, taking votes away. And then, because, when we think about voter eligibility law, we can also call that voter disenfranchisement law, right? Right? Voter eligibility law is essentially, here are the things that I'm going to use to disenfranchise you, right? If you clear those things, then you can vote. But otherwise, I'm going to take this vote away from you, right? For all these reasons. And we might agree as a community that some of those reasons are valid, right? Maybe 2-year-olds shouldn't vote. Well, that's a federal. But then the feds come along and say, I'm going to slap your hand there, right? You can't do that. And then the states say, okay, I won't do that. I'll do it. I'll do this over here, right? So what we have is I don't know why I'm using my fingers like this, but I've been sort of talking about is social movements have come along and prevented the states from doing that. But then the states just pop up 5 new things they can do. And really, it's less a dialogue between the feds and the states than it is the states doing a bunch of stuff and social movements leveraging the power of the federal government to discipline the states. That's really what it's been. And that has been a hard-fought victory. You think about the 15th Amendment. It took social activists 100 years to get the federal government to show any re-interest in the South, right, after the 15th Amendment, right? So in some ways, the feds really are not really part of this conversation unless social activists make them be. And even then, they're having an incredibly hard time leveraging the power of the federal government against the states. Social activists have only been able to do that intermittently throughout US history. For the most parts, the states have reigned supreme in disenfranchising people when and how they want to, partly because Americans have no right to vote that is being abridged by the states.
Thank you. Catherine, did you want to post some more of your questions?
I have a lot of questions. I just don't want to take away when others are coming in. As you've been talking about this, the ways that we frame our history are so important, right? We're not changing the events that happened in the past, but as we ask new questions, as we find new sources, as we look to new people, the story we tell about the past changes, of course, and you've worked so much on that. I was wondering if you have any lessons that you've learned that are sticking out in your mind foremost about how history is created and shared as you've looked at the story of women and voting in particular.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of the stuff we've already been talking about. In some ways, what you're pointing to now is kind of underlining a conversation and pulling out a thread that I think we've been developing over our lovely chat here. And I think that one of the things that drew me to history, I was actually a French major as an undergrad, I was not a history major, was when I understood that history is in fact living and not dead. And by that, I mean, it's not really so much about the past. It is, but it's really about how we tell the story in the present, because we are telling and leveraging that story in the present for purposes in the present. And so history is constantly changing because what the present needs of it is constantly changing. And so to me, really what's interesting to me is about history is how history lives. And I do think that Donald Trump's, 1776 historical initiative is absolutely about trying to make sure that certain historical narratives don't have traction in the present because they empower people that he does not want empowered. Right. So to me, I think what I would say to that, Catherine, is that to me, this is not about the past. This is about the present. And the stories we tell in the present are just reconfigurations of the past, right? But they are really about leveraging power in the present. And to me, historical memory and historical narration and historical commemoration is all about constructing power in the present. And so we must do it carefully. We cannot do it just kind of absentmindedly, triumphantly, because it conveys power in the present. It confers power in the present. And so we have to think about historical narration that way. There is no neutral version of the past that other people are trying to come in with a biased version of, right? So you get this kind of narration that we have right now about, there is history, and then there's people trying to rewrite history, right? And the idea is the history is the true stable thing, and then this rewriting is some kind of like biased, opinionated, discredited kind of activity. And that's not true. It's just that this one has stood so firmly. They're trying to make it seem as if that one's just self-evidently true. It's not. It's just as biased and selective and partisan and as anything else. And what those people trying to rewrite history are doing is saying, you've been in power for so long because you've held on to that as truth, and I'm going to challenge that as truth as a way of trying to leverage my power in the present, right? I'm going to challenge. And so, it's not coincidental that social movements always leverage history. Because history is so important to how we make meaning in the present. And, it's when I understood that history is really about the present that I became fascinated by being a historian. So that was a kind of long-winded answer to your question and somewhat of a digression, but I do think it's really important that we not allow the emperor with no clothes to kind of stand there and insist he's clothed, that history truth is like, I am the emperor, you will not challenge me. It's like, no, really, you don't have any clothes on. Like, you are just as biased as everybody else, right? Do you see what I'm like? It's so.
It has been so interesting as we've worked just in a little small way with local education, right? The stories that we tell about who matters, who made change happen in the United States, in our local history, in our national history, those really shape the ways that kids, that all of us see ourselves as citizens, as our rights and duties, as the ways we have to make change, the avenues we can follow. And I think that's very
why
powerful.
High school history curriculum is so hotly contested politically, because it tells, it's imparting all kinds of lessons about who we want our citizens to believe they are, and who matters and what matters. And that's contested in the present, so it's also contested in high school history curriculum.
Absolutely. I've got another question, but I'll let Holly please take over any point here.
No, I don't have any audience questions right now.
Oh, okay.
With your current work, Dr. Tetrault, maybe you can talk to us a little bit. I'm just wondering if you've noticed anything about how developments in the West or other things post-Civil War might have influenced the national movement, or do you see anything shaping the 19th Amendment or the way it plays out that happens in the West, or is it really, again, on the ground, all of these movements are happening at the same time in different ways and places?
So I don't think it's either or. I think it's all of, right? But until we bring all of it together, we can recover all the pieces and then bring it together. I don't think we can fully know the answer to that. I do think that when we think about the constitutional revolution of Reconstruction, which is the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, right? 13th is abolition of slavery, 14th is citizenship for African Americans, and then also equal protection and due process, which will become important later. And the 15th Amendment, black male voting, that constitutional revolution, I think we bring to bear too infrequently in terms of our understanding of how the suffrage movement unfolds after the American Civil War. I think that constitutional revolution actually has a really profound effect on the way the suffrage movement unfolds. And instead, we talk kind of somewhat pointlessly about, well, this group preferred this strategy and this group preferred that strategy. And it's like, actually, there's way more at stake here than strategy. This is about voting governance for our entire nation, right? But for some reason, we don't tell that story as if it actually matters for voting governance. It's just about the ladies. And one of the things that's really been frustrating to me about the story of suffrage as it existed, it's changing dramatically though, is that somehow we think it's bounded by the question of gender, as if it's not, that we can kind of, if we just follow the story of gender, we can understand the story of the 19th Amendment. And that's just simply not true, right? It is woven through and shot through all other pieces of American history, race, citizenship, class, So I would like to see all that come to play. And I think we really see that in the moment of Reconstruction. It's just that it's surprising how little we paid attention to it.
That's a really good point.
Okay, I've got anonymous attendee asking a question. Thank you. I want more audience questions. Going in my teacher voice. Is there any evidence that women voting in the West might have been enacted or used as a specific economic development strategy as territories to struggle to attract settlers and development? Is that Wyoming?
Yeah, so one of the things we really don't know the answer to is why the heck Wyoming, doesn't include male in its territorial constitution when it appoints voters. Now, one of the things to remember is that this was not a large body that wrote this territorial constitution. I think it was like 5 guys. How many guys was it? I mean, it was like a handful of guys out in Wyoming, like writing a territorial constitution. So, and for whatever reasons, they don't include the word male in their list of voter qualifications. We honestly, I don't know, unless you know, Catherine, more than I do, we honestly don't know why that happens. And one of the arguments has been that this was a civilizing strategy, right? To bring the ladies out, to civilize the men who were there largely on their own and thereby, unruly and rowdy and, not respectable in terms of statehood. The most important, or the most interesting to me, recent argument about Wyoming and this idea of kind of economic development strategy is less about, we just want to make sure that the guys are okay and that they're not too rowdy. Instead is by Virginia Scharf, who writes this really great article trying to look at something that people have looked at in global history, but the ways in which suffrage was used really as a kind of colonizationist strategy, as opposed to let's discipline the unruly men, but really as a way of trying to enforce colonization over Wyoming, which really at this point had way more Native folks in it than white folks, right? So I think that's a really interesting argument that she's put forth to try to get us to think about the really conservative side of Wyoming granting, women voting as a kind of way of creating colonial power. And that to me is more interesting than this kind of idea of, it is to attract settlers and development in the way that the autonomous attendee says, but less in a kind of manifest destiny kind of way and more in let's think through the complex politics of this. So Catherine, did you want to speak to this kind of Western phenomenon? And then I think, there are stories that I've heard you guys in your panel kind of disabuse the audience of, then Utah does it because of polygamy. And that, people sort of think they know that. And then the rest of the West, I don't think we have a really clear idea why the rest of the West enfranchises women. Rebecca Mead has a book on this, and she's like, well, they were strategically better. And it's like, well, I don't know that that's sufficient to win the vote, right? I mean, they were pretty strategic in the East, so I just feel like we don't have good answers.
I agree. And I think part of it is that in many ways, whether it's Wyoming as this stunt to get more women settlers, or as many people have dismissed the Utah law as an experiment or as a PR ploy on at the hands of Latter-day Saint leaders in order to say women are great here, everything's fine. And whatever the reasons male lawmakers had, the interesting thing to me is that the women's stories usually get erased. Partially because there isn't a large movement to gain the vote. Say in Wyoming in 1869, they're not marching in the streets. Same thing in 1870 in Utah, although they are holding indignation meetings to fight anti-polygamy legislation. So women are involved in politics in some way there. But I think one of the myths, one of the problems with this myth as you're bringing it up, that it obscures women's very real political participation. And that did happen for whatever reason as women are voting and engaging in the political process in that way, although they of course have other ways to influence public affairs besides voting. I think that really changes the way that they see themselves as citizens, which is not something that's a clear-cut issue at the time, as Americans, as people with a stake in society. And to me, those are the interesting questions that we lose out on when we just say, well, men just gave women the vote for X, Y, and Z reasons. There, as you've mentioned, there are many other problems with that framing of the story as well. But then we forget about what the women did with it.
Yeah,
as well.
Well said. Yeah.
I would be interested to know as well, just if you have thoughts from, why maybe the West has been forgotten, and maybe this has kind of gone along with this, why we haven't dug into these suffrage movements. For example, there isn't a large body of scholarship on what's going on in Washington Territory or Utah or other places.
I don't know. I think for some of the reasons we already talked about would probably be my guess, but I'm sure that I'm, not at all creating a sufficient inventory of the answer there. But I do think that the stuff we talked about earlier, the idea that this was a national story, right, that we don't really have to pay attention, that we focus on the federal amendment as opposed to what's happening in the states, that we focus on federal leaders, that we focus, and that we haven't, I think, adequately recovered those histories at the local level. We've just kind of slotted them in as, sub-points of the national story as opposed to stories on their own. But I don't know. What are your thoughts about that? I mean, you're working on that exactly. So.
Well,
I'm thinking much better answer than I do.
No, I think about your terms about just re-narrating. I think we tend to come with a framework in mind, whether it's what we learned in U.S. history in high school or 5th grade, or the books that we've read that kind of lays out where change happens and who matters and who's important, that sometimes leaves out the West. And then, as you say, having that body of sources, it's not that sources don't exist, but having sources that are accessible and that people know about and have been using a body of scholarship to build on. That takes a while. And then, of course, you're talking about people who are working to win the vote before you can stage parades down Washington, D.C. that will be filmed or photographed for the newspapers. And I think having that visual culture later on, that's one of Alice Paul's genius strokes in many ways. But the lack of that earlier makes it hard to tell.
Right. We want to
can't make a documentary as easily when you don't have that.
Alison Lang's new book, Picturing Political Power, is a really important thing about the visuals of it. I would also say, though, that the part of the problem we face is that the archive itself is deeply structured around this kind of 1848 national 1920s story. And so also I think archival saving practices have handicapped us in our terms of being able to recover the kinds of histories that weren't deemed, save-worthy at the time. Somebody just wrote in about Asian American immigrants and how do they fit into sort of the story of China, or in the West Coast would have had a wide variety of Asian American immigrants. And the story is that the Chinese Exclusion Act, starting in 1880, it pretty much bars them from entry into the United States for decades. So they're allowed in on certain criteria, and generally it's like, and so there aren't many Asian Americans present. And then once they're allowed in, starting in the 40s and the 50s, then they have to clear all the kinds of state hurdles that, first they have to clear citizenship, which is its own cumbersome process, but citizenship itself doesn't give you voting, right? Then you have to clear all the state obstacles that you face. And so many Asian Americans will also be vastly aided by the Voting Rights Act, because it will strike down the kinds of things that are also barring them from voting. And, I don't know the story of Utah. Part of the problem being able to make any sweeping generalizations about any of this is that there are no sweeping generalizations. It's all local. So you have to know what happened in Utah, what happened in California, what happened in Washington. And I don't have an encyclopedic knowledge of exactly when or how people would have, of Asian American descent would have finally accessed voting in either California or Utah. But the Voting Rights Act would have been a piece of that story. Even though we think of that as a kind of Southern, African-American story. It was not only. So.
Here's a really nice question from Hope Eggett. She asks, in what ways did the strategies that Black women's suffrage associations, how did their strategies differ from white women's?
Yeah, so I would point you to Martha Jones's new book, Vanguard, where she tries to narrate a new story about Black women's suffrage activism, but not only, as a piece of Black women's much larger political visions, from 1820 to 2020 as her kind of timeline. And, many of the things that people find is that one of the things in your question, Ms. Eggett, would be that people don't necessarily just talk about Black women's suffrage associations, right? Suffrage association is really a kind of white organizing strategy that Black women don't necessarily use, because they can't isolate out gender when it comes to race, because Black men are also facing disenfranchisement, and they wouldn't isolate out suffrage as the one thing they cared about. So although Ida B. Wells will create the Alpha Suffrage Club and things like that, you don't really find Black women's voting rights activism in something called Black women's suffrage organizing. I mean, it's there, and there is Black women's suffrage organizing in the National Association of, Colored Women, and the, the Federation, or the, National Colored Women's Movement, Colored Women's Club movement, and things like that. But they're always, one of the things I would say that distinguishes their activism is that voting is always linked to a much broader set of demands and of concerns and of preoccupations. And then one of the things that many people also argue is that part of what distinguished Black women's activism from white women's activism is that this was never about individual empowerment. This was about community uplift. And you think sort of Mary Church Terrell's very famous sort of lifting as we climb, right? That this is about bringing up the entire community, and we need the vote for all people to bring up the race out of the kinds of racist degradation that people are suffering. So, and then, one of the things that would have distinguished Black women's activism, of course, would have been like absolute tight alliance with men who were also trying to recover voting. So, it was a lot of different things, but one of the things that happens for Black women is that inside civil rights organizing, they encounter all kinds of sexism. And so it's not like they have an easy time getting their voices and their concerns raised inside Black men's, meetings and things. So, it's a cumbersome thing, but Black women will also, they will just, as this has been repeated often, it's not a phrase of mine, but, will make a way out of no way. They will find ways to remain politically active, to leverage political power, to influence situations and debates, even without the vote. When we think of it that way, Black women's political power is pretty mighty. And still today, really the backbone of the Democratic Party is not white women, it's Black women. And so, Black women can make or break the Democratic Party. And so Black women have tremendous voting power and influence. We just tend not to think of them as a bloc. So.
Do we have any more audience questions? And in the meantime, Catherine.
I think this is something that you've already brought up, Dr. Tetrault, but I'm just thinking about 1920, when we've, generally, especially in this white suffrage story, that's where we've ended the story. The narrative is we triumph, we go home, and then what happens, right? But are there other things that you would point to that people had expected to change after 1920 that didn't? For example, you've talked a lot about why how the case is that many people are still, of course, kept from the polls because there are other barriers that have not been taken away by this amendment. But are there other things that people expected would happen once women, quote unquote, entered politics or quote unquote won the right to vote that did or did not play out as expected?
Yeah, a bunch of stuff happens. One of the things we have to remember is that women don't enter politics in 1920. So the question itself, which constantly gets asked, and is not just your question, Catherine, it's like, so what happened when women entered politics in 1920? It's like, well, women have already been present in politics for a very long time. So we have to, in some ways, just revamp the idea that there's supposed to be a huge break in 1920, right? The whole idea that like somehow there should be a big shift in 1920 is itself suspect in many ways. Because women have always been present in politics. But it's true that there was a massive influx of women into the voting populace, and this is a break. So one of the things that people look at is, did women vote? And there are all kinds of ways in which that becomes an incredibly difficult thing to count. And I think of Christina Wolbrecht and other people, political scientists, who try to count this and estimate that, they didn't vote in massive numbers. I'm not sure that should be so surprising in some ways. I'm not sure that people have then argued that women's suffrage, the amendment, if we want to call women's suffrage the amendment, right, if we're going to use those two words as conflated, which I don't think we should, but they're often used that way as conflated, there was a huge failure. Women didn't leverage their voting power. They didn't even turn out to vote. What a waste of time, And there's all kinds of ways in which that's completely unhelpful for understanding this particular moment. But I think one of the things that happened, and Nancy Cott and other historians have talked about this, women didn't vote as a bloc because women were never unified in the first place, right? So, and why would women be any more unified than men are? Men don't vote as a bloc, right? So part of what I think of the suffrage movement, right, if we're kind of looking at the national movement that we see around the 19th Amendment, deludes us into thinking is that women are unified in this big thing. And they're not. They're not unified at all. In fact, they almost stop talking about what you can do with a vote because it divides everybody so much, right? Everyone agrees we want the vote, but not for the same purpose. Everyone wants the vote for a different reason. And so what women do after they access voting, if they access voting, is that they scatter and they go pursue all the kinds of things that they wanted to vote for. And so people mistake this as, oh, they didn't influence politics. They didn't have a presence in politics. They do in all kinds of ways. It's just that it's no longer under one umbrella, right? They scatter and they do all kinds of things. So women do have political influence, just not in the way that we've framed the question, where is the women's bloc going to do the thing? And that has never materialized. And the fact that we expect it to, I think, is itself a problem with the question, not with the outcome.
I've got two questions lined up. One via text message from Lisa Buckmiller, who asks that you explain the Ancestry project, the project you've been doing with Ancestry.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that COVID had a heavy hit on the Ancestry project.
Everything.
And it's too bad because it was just really such a brilliant idea. So Ancestry has all of these records that illuminate not just family trees, but all kinds of things about how individual Americans have shaped American democracy and how individual Americans have shaped all kinds of historical trends and historical developments. So one of the things Ancestry wanted to do was open its records and allow people to go in and try to think about not just, when was my grandmother born or when was my great-grandmother born, but also what would have their connection to this story have been? So, when did my ancestor vote? Did they vote? Do we even have records of them voting? Because in many cases, those records don't exist. And so the Ancestry Project was to encourage people to look at these genealogy records with an eye toward thinking about the place of your ancestors in the development of American democracy. And not just when it comes to the 19th Amendment, but the Voting Rights Act, the 15th Amendment, all kinds of things along the way. Part of what we found is that local voting records are often not very carefully kept. And so you can't always answer the question of who votes and who doesn't vote. these things don't get kept until much later, or the kinds of polling and things. So you can find out kind of eligibility, but you can't necessarily figure out whether or not somebody voted. And there were some really beautiful projects of people who are descendants of really important historical actors, sort of talking about the ways in which these memories have been kept alive inside their families. Don Duster, who is the descendant of Ida B. Wells, along with Michelle Duster, talking about the ways in which Ida B. Wells has shaped both, their life trajectory. They're the great-grandchildren of Ida B. Wells, and also the kinds of ways in which voting has figured in their lives, from a kind of family history of that, and also a sense of commitment and duty. There was a descendant from Jeanette Rankin, descendants from Harry T. Byrne. So just thinking through the ways in which the ways in which this history lives on in family histories, and the ways in which, this isn't necessarily unknown to all people. In a lot of family histories, we carry this story with us, and how has that shaped our present? So that was the Ancestry Project. And you can still go on, and you can try to go into those records and try to find out, exactly. But it requires figuring out what the local state ordinances were in your particular state, and then in your county, and then in your right. So it didn't turn out to be the kind of, in 1965 my relative was here, or in 1920 my relative was here. It's a more cumbersome process than that. And then of course COVID, made all of that incredibly impossible. But I do think it's a really beautiful thing to think about. How did our ancestors fit into this history, right? Like how did that fit? So
we've got a comment from Pat. And she says, there's little research on the suffrage movement in Idaho. Their equal suffrage amendment passed on its first try in 1896. A more recent study indicates that the miners' opposition, because of the fear of the temperance issues, was preoccupied with the silver issue, 1896. So the amendment was ignored and passed. So that makes sense.
Yeah, I don't know the exact story of the Idaho campaign. I mean, I think of Rebecca Mead's work, Beverly Beaton, kind of earlier. Is that how she says her last name? I think it's Beverly Beaton. Other people, who've worked on Idaho, but I don't have a kind of, state by state recall of exactly. But one of the things that I think of 1896 and silver here and other things. We had a pretty robust third-party movement in this era of populism, and populism did support women's voting. So I wonder if some of this isn't also tied to, a populist political movement, and how that kind of third-party activism, brought about a different kind of political configuration. So.
That fits right with 1896.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see, Catherine, do you want to ask anything? I think we need to wrap up here, so let's make this our last question.
I don't even really have a question, but just going back to your Ancestry project, I've been thinking about some of the most meaningful parts of the commemorations, educational programs, things that we've tried to do here and locally with Better Days 2020 have been those tied to family members and descendants of women who made change and push things forward. So I'd just like to encourage Utahns to visit. There's a new memorial on the grounds of our state capitol at Council Hall, which is the site of the first woman's vote here in 1870. But that includes an ever-expanding pathway framed with doorways that mark different pieces of legislation that, again, as you talked about, struck down these barriers to enable more people to participate more fully in policymaking and in voting. And I think that's one of the best things that we've heard all year has been your talk today, to reframe and recenter how we think about women's activism for the vote, and how we think about where that leaves us and what our part is in that ongoing legacy. So thank you.
Part of what I want to do is link that story back to the story of American democracy and not tell it as this isolated story around gender, which is completely unhelpful. But is that monument or that memorial visible online? I would love to see it. It sounds beautiful.
I will send
the idea
you
of
I'll send you
doors
a link
kind of opening onto new doors is such a brilliant sculptural element, it seems to me, to illuminate this history.
We were really pleased with the artist's vision there.
And I should also say the Ancestry Project absolutely belongs to Ancestry. Like, it was not my project, but I had the good fortune of being a historical consultant with the project. So that was one of the great joys of the anniversary. So.
Right. Any last words, Lisa?
No, just thank you so much for creating space and opportunity to discuss all these important issues, which are still so live. And I think that's been the best thing about the centennial, has been the opportunity to remind us how living these issues are, and how important they are in terms of how we decide where our democracy goes from here. So thank you so much for the time and the space and the opportunity and the fellowship and everything else. I will see you out there wherever that is.
All right. Thank you. Thank you to our audience, to Catherine Kitterman. This will be on YouTube sometime soon. And also join us this evening on YouTube for our publication awards and achievement awards. Thank you so much, Catherine Kitterman, Lisa Tetrault, for very informative keynote. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much to both of you as well.
Okay.